first thing you notice when the detective walked into Harlem was the way the air changed. It wasn't the kind of change that came from a summer heat wave or the smell of fried chicken from the corner diner. No, it was the heavy, suffocating pressure of authority gone too far. The kind that made grown men tense, made mothers clutch their children a little tighter, and made even the boldest hustlers reconsider their next move. And tonight, that pressure had a name: Detective Harold McCready. He didn't just enforce the law, he commanded it with a swagger that suggested the law existed solely to remind Harlem who was in charge. On this evening, he'd chosen to make an example out of the neighborhood, targeting small shopkeepers, street vendors, anyone who dared cross his invisible line. And everyone knew. The system had eyes, and McCready's gaze was colder than winter in Harlem. But Harlem had its own way of balancing the scales. And there was one man in particular who made sure nobody forgot it. That man was Bumpy Johnson. Bumpy wasn't a man of petty threats or empty boasts. His reputation had been carved out over years of being both feared and respected. A figure who could command silence with a glance, who could settle disputes before they even started. His power wasn't in the law, it was in the streets, in the hearts of the people, in the unspoken code that said, "You don't disrespect this community without paying a price." That night, Bumpy sat in the dim glow of the nightclub back room, the music from the dance floor drifting in through a cracked door. He sipped on a whiskey, his eyes never leaving the doorway. Reports had come in that McCready was escalating, threatening the lives and livelihoods of anyone who stood in his way. And Harlem, tired of the fear, was waiting for Bumpy to act. He wasn't a man who rushed. Every move he made was measured, precise, the kind of patience that made his enemies miscalculate. But patience had its limits. And tonight, that limit was being tested. The streets outside whispered with tension. Shopkeepers had shuttered early. Boys on stoops had stopped tossing bottles and playing dice. Even the jazz spilling from the cotton club seemed subdued, as if the city itself held its breath. McCready's presence wasn't just a threat, it was a statement, and statements in Harlem had consequences. Bumpy's mind drifted for a moment to the community he had grown up in, the brownstones, the jazz halls, the corner stores where everyone knew your name and your business. McCready didn't see a community. He saw weakness, and weakness was something Bumpy never tolerated. He finished his whiskey, set the glass down, and leaned back. The glow from the streetlights through the blinds painted stripes across his face. Each stripe a shadow of a decision, a warning, a message. The community had already spoken in whispers and rumors. Now it was time for action in a way that the system understood, not through words, but through undeniable consequence. Harlem didn't wait for permission. It didn't appeal to courts or letters to editors. When the balance tipped too far, legends intervened. And Bumpy had a way of intervening that made even the most entrenched authority think twice. The legend of Bumpy Johnson wasn't born from violence alone. It came from a rare combination of intelligence, presence, and unshakable control. Men feared him because he was fearless. Authorities disliked him because he refused to play by their rules. But the people respected him because he delivered justice when the law would not. As McCready's patrol cars rolled closer, the faint echo of sirens bouncing off the tenements, Bumpy rose. Every muscle, every movement radiated calm readiness. He didn't need to yell. He didn't need to threaten. The The city itself seemed to lean in, waiting to see how this confrontation would unfold. Tonight, the stakes were more than territory or pride. They were about the soul of Harlem itself. McCready had the badge, the gun, the system behind him. But Bumpy had something far more powerful: legitimacy in the eyes of those who mattered most. And in Harlem, that legitimacy carried weight the law could never measure. The first step had to be bold, and Bumpy Johnson didn't hesitate. He moved toward the street, the night air thick with tension, the sounds of the city muted beneath the weight of destiny. Every head turned as he passed. Every whisper carried the name that had become legend. He wasn't just confronting a man tonight. He was confronting an entire system that had overstepped its bounds. And he would do it with the clarity, precision, and authority that had earned him the reputation he carried. A reputation built not just on fear, but on respect. The alleyway ahead was narrow, the streetlights flickering like hesitant witnesses. McCready waited, confident in the power of his badge, unaware that he was about to step into a confrontation that would remind him and everyone under his command that in Harlem, respect wasn't demanded, it was earned. And Bumpy Johnson was about to remind the city, the detective, and the system itself exactly who earned it. Harlem in the early 1950s wasn't just a neighborhood. It was a living, breathing organism, pulsing with music, commerce, struggle, and pride. The streets had a rhythm of their own, one that could be broken by chaos but maintained by order. And in that order, Bumpy Johnson was a cornerstone. Born into the harsh realities of the city, Bumpy had learned early that power wasn't given, it was claimed. But unlike many who ruled through intimidation alone, Bumpy ruled through a mixture of intelligence, loyalty, and calculated force. He understood the streets as others understood law books, and he had the uncanny ability to predict moves before they were made. People said he could walk into a room and know exactly who was lying, who was afraid, and who would step aside when his presence demanded it. His territory stretched across the heart of Harlem, from 125th Street down to the southern blocks near the docks. The businesses, clubs, and streets under his watch flourished, not because he demanded tribute, but because he demanded respect. And when the system, or men like McCready, threatened that respect, Bumpy's response was swift and decisive. Every corner held a story of his influence. The butcher on Lenox Avenue, who had once been bullied by corrupt officers, now ran his shop free of harassment. The jazz club owner, whose venue had been targeted by gangs, now thrived thanks to Bumpy's protection. His presence wasn't just felt, it was seen, heard, and, most importantly, respected. Harlem had legends, but Bumpy was the kind whose reputation didn't fade. It spread, whispered from street corner to brownstone stoop. Yet the city outside his influence was changing. Police departments were growing more aggressive, emboldened by political pressure to clean up neighborhoods they barely understood. Detectives like McCready arrived in Harlem with the arrogance of outsiders, believing a badge could replace knowledge, that fear alone could command obedience. They didn't know that Harlem didn't bend easily, and it never bent without consequences. Bumpy had dealt with lawmen before, men who thought they could humiliate him, intimidate his associates, or disrupt his operations. Some left humiliated, some left injured, and some never left at all. But Bumpy's strength was never in retaliation for its own sake. It was in sending a message, a singular, unmistakable declaration. Do not threaten the people under my protection. And that protection was more than physical. It was moral. The community trusted him not because he claimed power, but because he delivered justice where the law failed. Families who had been victimized by corrupt enforcement knew that under Bumpy's oversight, they could breathe a little easier. Shopkeepers who had been shaken down for weeks found stability. And in a world that often turned a blind eye to the powerless, Bumpy Johnson made sure someone was always watching, always acting. That night, as he walked the streets toward McCready, the legend carried not only himself, but the weight of an entire community. People peeked from windows, children paused mid-game, and mothers whispered his name with a mix of awe and relief. He didn't need to shout. His footsteps spoke louder than any protest. McCready, on the other hand, strode with the swagger of authority unchallenged. He didn't understand why the neighborhood fell silent. To him, a badge was enough. A gun was enough. He saw control in terms of fear and paperwork, not relationships, not history. And tonight, that misunderstanding would be his downfall. As Bumpy approached the block where McCready had been making rounds, the tension thickened. There was no grand showdown yet, no gunfire or shouting, just the quiet hum of the city holding its breath. And in that silence, the stakes were clear. This wasn't about ego. It wasn't about a man proving himself. This was about who controlled the heartbeat of Harlem, who decided what justice looked like when the system failed. Bumpy paused outside a streetlight, letting it illuminate the sharp lines of his face. Every man and woman who saw him felt it, the calm, unshakable confidence of a man who had walked through every storm Harlem could throw at him and emerged stronger. In a moment, he would confront McCready directly. But first, he allowed the streets to remember why his presence mattered. Inside McCready's mind, there was already a plan. He believed intimidation would work, that he could force compliance with the mere threat of authority. But he hadn't accounted for the loyalty Bumpy inspired, nor the intelligence with which he wielded influence. The detective had chosen to see Harlem as a chessboard, but Bumpy was the player who had spent decades learning every move before it was ever made. The stage was set. The community watched from the shadows, holding their collective breath. Every street corner, every flickering light, every silent observer bore witness to what would unfold. And when Bumpy stepped onto the street where McCready stood, the balance of power was about to be challenged in a way the system had never anticipated. This was the calm before the storm, the tense pause before legend met authority. And in Harlem, when Bumpy Johnson moved, the city moved with him. The block was quiet, but it wasn't peaceful. Every step Bumpy took echoed against the brick facades, a rhythmic warning that something was about to shift. Up ahead, Detective McCready leaned against the hood of his patrol car, cigarette smoke curling into the cold Harlem air. He looked the part of authority, badge gleaming, shoulders squared, eyes scanning. But there was arrogance in that posture, the kind that underestimated the streets he thought he ruled. "Evening, Johnson," McCready called, voice loud enough to carry across the empty street. He tipped his hat, a mock gesture of civility, though it carried a sneer underneath. "The neighborhood's restless tonight. I've been making rounds, keeping everyone in line." Bumpy stopped several feet away, hands at his sides, his gaze steady. "I hear that, Detective. Harlem appreciates your attention," he said, his voice calm but heavy with implication. Every word was measured, every syllable carrying the weight of unspoken warning. Macready smirked, stepping closer. "You're a man with a reputation, Johnson. I get that. But reputation doesn't mean law doesn't apply to you. Don't think your little influence changes what happens when someone crosses me." Bumpy's eyes narrowed slightly, but his expression remained composed. "Crossing you?" he asked, letting the words hang in the cold air. "Detective, you've been crossing the community all week. Shopkeepers, kids, neighbors. You think that's law?" Macready laughed, a sharp, abrasive sound that seemed to bounce off the buildings like a warning shot. "The law doesn't ask permission from anyone, not from a legend, not from the street. You want to protect the neighborhood? Fine, but don't interfere with me." The words were deliberate, calculated. Macready believed he was testing Bumpy, measuring him like one might test a cornered animal. But he misread entirely. Bumpy wasn't cornered. Bumpy didn't act on impulse. He acted with precision, and right now the air between them was electric with anticipation. A few spectators had begun to appear from the shadows. Shopkeepers, young men leaning on stoops, mothers watching from windows. They didn't intervene. They didn't need to. But the moment was no longer just between two men. It had become a demonstration of power, a spectacle of respect versus authority. "Let me be clear," Bumpy said, stepping closer, his voice carrying effortlessly over the still street. "You threaten the people under my watch. You make them fear the very place they call home. That's crossing me. That's crossing everyone who relies on me. And detective?" He paused, letting the name linger, heavy as iron. "I don't take that lightly." Macready's hand twitched toward his belt, fingers brushing the edge of his revolver. "You think you scare me, Johnson?" he said, voice raising. "I've dealt with bigger than you, bigger than anyone in Harlem." Bumpy didn't flinch. He tilted his head slightly, measuring, observing, weighing. "Bigger?" he asked quietly. "You're not even close to understanding what Harlem considers big." His eyes scanned the faces peeking from doorways, then back to Macready. "You want to test law against legend? Go ahead, but don't say I didn't warn you." The detective's arrogance had blinded him to the truth. In Harlem, law and order weren't defined by badges alone. Influence, respect, and loyalty mattered more than any citation or warrant. And Bumpy's influence wasn't theoretical. It was lived, breathed, and obeyed by an entire neighborhood. Macready sneered, stepping forward aggressively. "You talk a big game, Johnson, but talk doesn't keep the streets in line. My precinct decides what's legal. My word is law here. Don't forget that." Bumpy's hand brushed the edge of his coat, not for a weapon, but for presence. The movement was subtle, yet it carried a quiet threat. He didn't need to touch Macready's authority physically. Every person on the street understood the implied power of Bumpy Johnson: interference, retaliation, consequence. And the detective, arrogant and unaware, had walked into the wrong block tonight. "You see, detective," Bumpy said, voice low, dangerous. "Law isn't just written on paper. It's enforced in the hearts of people. And when you abuse it to terrorize the community, you're not law. You're a threat. And threats get handled." Macready laughed again, more nervously this time. He could feel the shift. Something was different. This wasn't just another man trying to make trouble. This was Bumpy Johnson, the man whose reputation didn't just survive Harlem streets. It dominated them. And for the first time, McCready realized his badge wouldn't protect him from respect lost or influence challenged. A tense silence fell. Bumpy's presence radiated a calm that belied the storm ready to erupt. The street seemed to contract, the lights flickering like hesitant witnesses to the impending confrontation. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the distant wail of a passing siren felt muted, as if the city itself paused to watch. It was a moment suspended between threat and consequence. McCready had the authority of the law behind him, but Bumpy had something infinitely more potent: legitimacy in the eyes of Harlem. One wrong word, one careless action, and the detective would find himself in a position far more precarious than any arrest he had ever conducted. Bumpy's gaze didn't falter. "Tonight," he said, voice cutting through the silence like a blade, "you learn the difference between fear and respect. And in Harlem, detective, respect is earned, not enforced." And with that, the tension reached a breaking point. The city held its breath. Every observer knew that the moment of reckoning was imminent. Bumpy Johnson had issued the first warning, but in the silence, everyone sensed the real confrontation was about to begin. The streetlights flickered over the empty block like reluctant witnesses, illuminating a standoff that had everyone in Harlem holding their breath. Bumpy Johnson didn't move aggressively. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. Yet every step he took toward Detective McCready carried a weight the law couldn't measure. Authority built on decades of survival, intelligence, and earned respect. McCready, standing with his chest puffed, tried to maintain the illusion of control. "You really think you can walk me down, Johnson? You think your reputation scares me?" His hand hovered near his revolver, just enough to show intent. Bumpy stopped 5 feet away, the glow of the streetlight splitting his face into shadow and light. Calm, deliberate, he looked the detective squarely in the eyes. "It doesn't scare you," he said softly, almost conversational. "It informs you. There's a difference, detective, and tonight you're going to learn it the hard way." McCready laughed, a sharp, abrasive sound meant to break the tension, but it rang hollow. Something about Bumpy's presence made it impossible to dismiss the threat he carried. This wasn't bravado. It was inevitability. "You've been making threats all week," Bumpy continued, voice steady, unwavering. "Threats to children, to shopkeepers, to neighbors who pay their taxes, work hard, and expect to live without fear. And for what? A badge? A title? Do you really believe that gives you the right to terrorize the community?" The detective's hand twitched again, closer to his gun. "And what, Johnson? You think you're above the law? You think your influence—" Bumpy interrupted, calm but ice cold. "Influence isn't above the law, detective. It's alongside it, where the law has failed. And tonight, it will remind you where you belong." The words hit harder than any punch, heavier than the weight of the badge in McCready's hand. The detective flinched slightly, though no one else would have noticed. Everyone in the block did. Harlem knew that Bumpy's warnings were never idle. Bumpy took another step forward, letting the tension tighten like a coiled spring. "You've been abusing your authority, thinking you can dictate fear. But in my city, fear without respect is weakness. And weakness," he said, letting the word hang, "has consequences." McCready swallowed. For the first time, the detective realized he had miscalculated. He thought this would be an intimidation game, a simple exercise of the law against a man of the streets. He hadn't understood that in Harlem, power wasn't just a gun or a badge. It was loyalty, intelligence, timing, and above all, reputation. And Bumpy Johnson was the living embodiment of all four. "You want to teach me a lesson?" McCready snapped, voice rising, the first crack in his confidence. "Do it. Show me what the streets can do." Bumpy's eyes didn't flicker. His jaw tightened. "I'm not here to teach lessons for pride. I'm here to restore balance. Tonight, the people of this block will see the difference between authority earned and authority enforced." Then, with a subtle motion that would have gone unnoticed to anyone untrained in reading presence, Bumpy shifted slightly, tilting his head, letting McCready feel the invisible pressure of a man who had never been wrong about a single move in Harlem. The detective's pulse quickened, his bravado faltering under the weight of Bumpy's unspoken warning. "You think you've intimidated everyone on this block, detective," Bumpy said, voice low, deliberate. "But the people watching right now, they're not scared. They're waiting to see if someone with your badge has the courage to stand against justice. And you," he leaned slightly closer, eyes piercing, "have already failed." The silence was absolute, broken only by the faint hum of distant traffic and the occasional clatter of a shuttered window. The street seemed to lean in, the night itself holding its breath. McCready realized he wasn't facing a man. He was facing an institution, a force of nature molded in leather coats, alleyways, and decades of loyalty. "You've been threatening the community," Bumpy continued, voice resonant, almost ceremonial. "Tonight, the threat ends, not because I like confrontation, not because I want revenge, but because someone has to remind you that in Harlem, respect is not optional. It's mandatory." McCready's hand hovered near his gun again, but he hesitated. Something in Bumpy's presence, the calm certainty, the inevitability, made the weapon feel useless. This wasn't a street scuffle. It wasn't a gunfight waiting to happen. This was a reckoning of authority, and Bumpy Johnson was administering it with precision. Finally, Bumpy straightened, letting a faint smile brush across his lips. Not cruel, not arrogant, but assured. "Walk away, detective," he said simply. "Tonight, you leave. And you remember, the streets you patrol aren't just lines on a map. They're people. And if you threaten them again, you'll learn the hard way that respect here isn't demanded. It's enforced by those who earned it." McCready's jaw tightened. His pride stung, his ego bruised, but every instinct told him this wasn't the time to escalate. Slowly, deliberately, he took a step back, then another. The detective's patrol car sat behind him, lights dimmed, an unspoken retreat forming. The block exhaled. The tension dissolved, replaced by a quiet reverence. Shopkeepers peeked from windows. Young men on stoops leaned forward. Mothers whispered thanks to the night. And Bumpy Johnson, silent, authoritative, unshakable, had reminded the system where true power resided in Harlem. He didn't need a fight. He didn't need bloodshed. One confrontation, one display of controlled, unwavering presence, and the message was clear. This was Bumpy Johnson's city. Not because he ruled it by fear, but because he commanded respect. And those who threatened the people would learn that the streets themselves answer to him. The detective turned and walked back to his car, pride battered, authority questioned, understanding finally dawning that he had underestimated more than a man. He had underestimated a legend, and in that moment, Harlem watched and learned. The night air in Harlem felt lighter after McCready retreated. It wasn't that the danger had disappeared. Authority still had its badge, its guns, its rules. But the fear that had gripped the streets for days was gone. In its place was a quiet reverence, a collective understanding that some forces couldn't be bullied or broken. Word traveled fast. By the next morning, every corner store, every brownstone, every jazz hall knew the story. Bumpy Johnson had faced down a detective who believed his badge meant more than respect. He had done it without violence, without chaos, yet with a power no gun or warrant could ever match. Shopkeepers went about their morning routines differently. Where before they had flinched at every approaching officer, now they held their heads high. Mothers walked their children to school with a little more confidence, and kids tossed their baseballs on the streets without fearing a sudden threat. Bumpy had restored more than just order. He had restored dignity. Even those who hadn't witnessed the confrontation firsthand felt its impact. Every man and woman in Harlem who had once tolerated harassment from law enforcement now felt the invisible shield of Bumpy's presence. McCready's actions no longer held weight because the legend of Bumpy Johnson had reminded everyone that real authority comes not from titles, but from earned respect. Inside the nightclub where Bumpy often held counsel, his closest associates gathered. They spoke in hushed tones, admiration in their eyes. "He didn't even touch him," one said. "Just walked up and that was it." The detective backed down. "That's Bumpy," another replied. "He doesn't need a fight. He doesn't need a show of violence. One word, one look, and the city remembers who keeps the balance." The community outside reinforced the lesson. When officers made their rounds, they did so with more caution, more respect. They no longer acted with unchecked intimidation because everyone, police included, knew the cost of disrespecting the streets under Bumpy's watch. The system had been challenged, and it had learned its limits. Even McCready felt the consequences. He returned to his precinct quietly, avoiding the eyes of colleagues who had witnessed his retreat. Whispers followed him. The man who had mocked the neighborhood had been undone by one of its sons, a man whose reputation was stronger than any badge. Pride bruised, he realized that authority wasn't absolute. It was contingent on recognition, respect, and the awareness that the people he policed had their own power. For Bumpy, the victory wasn't about humiliation. It was about justice. It was about sending a clear message that the community would no longer suffer at the hands of those who thought fear was law. He didn't celebrate with fireworks or fanfare. He didn't need to. The streets themselves sang the acknowledgement, whispered in the rustle of leaves, the clatter of shutters, the hum of everyday life continuing without terror. In the following weeks, the change was tangible. Shopkeepers no longer paid bribes out of fear. Children could play without interruption. Families walked confidently in neighborhoods that had once seemed controlled by intimidation. McCready himself became cautious, more aware that his authority had limits, and that some lines, when crossed, invoked a response beyond what he could control. The community's response cemented the legend further. Harlem recognized that Bumpy Johnson was more than a figure of fear. He was a stabilizer, a protector, a man who had turned authority on its head to serve justice. And in doing so, He strengthened the bond between the streets and those who lived there, proving that respect earned could outweigh fear imposed. For Bumpy, the night's actions were just another chapter in a life defined by confrontation, control, and the unshakable balance of power. He had proven that even a system built on force and intimidation could be checked by one man who understood the true currency of influence. By the time the sun rose over Harlem, the city itself seemed to breathe easier. Order, respect, and dignity had been restored, not by law alone, but by the hands and presence of the man who had earned the right to enforce it. Bumpy Johnson, the legend who walked the streets as both judge and guardian, ensuring that justice had a face the community could trust. Years later, the story of that night traveled across Harlem like a gospel, not through newspapers or police reports, but through whispers on street corners, jazz clubs, and brownstone stoops. The tale was simple, but its meaning was profound. Bumpy Johnson had faced down the system, unarmed but unyielding, and the system had retreated. This was more than a single victory over one detective. It was a lesson that reverberated through every level of authority that dared step into Harlem. Bumpy's confrontation with McCready became a benchmark, a reference point for anyone trying to understand the power dynamics of the city. Those who once doubted his influence learned that in Harlem, law was only part of the equation. Respect, loyalty, and moral authority carried weight the law could never replicate. Harlem remembered the details. They remembered the quiet authority in Bumpy's step, the cold clarity in his gaze, the words he spoke that made a man with a gun and badge hesitate. They remembered how the community had paused, waiting, watching, and ultimately witnessing the affirmation that their dignity mattered. And with that, Bumpy's reputation shifted from feared enforcer to revered guardian. Merchants, long weary of harassment and corruption, told stories of how they could operate safely under Bumpy's watch. Club owners who once feared raids and intimidation learned that the streets had an invisible shield that no outsider could breach. Children who had been warned to fear authority learned instead that some power could protect, not just punish. Even those within law enforcement came to understand that Bumpy Johnson was not just a man. They recognized him as a force, one whose judgment carried the weight of the streets themselves. Officers who had once approached Harlem with arrogance learned to tread carefully, respecting boundaries they would have otherwise ignored. McCready's retreat became emblematic, a lesson internalized quietly but widely. There were consequences when one crossed the line. For Bumpy, the legacy wasn't in recognition or applause. It was in the sustained order, the protection of those who relied on him, and the knowledge that Harlem could trust one of its own to stand between them and chaos. It was in the subtle shifts, the street vendors who worked in peace, the neighborhoods where kids played freely, the small victories that collectively ensured the community's dignity remained intact. Historically, the event marked a turning point. In a city struggling with corruption, exploitation, and the weight of systemic oppression, Bumpy Johnson became a figure both legendary and practical. He reminded the people and those who sought to control them that authority untempered by justice is hollow, and that power wielded without respect is fragile. And the legend only grew over time. Decades later, even as the streets evolved, The story of Bumpy standing down a detective became shorthand for his unparalleled influence. Writers, musicians, and historians would recount that night as one of the defining moments in his career, a concrete example of how one man could protect an entire neighborhood, not with brute force alone, but with presence, intelligence, and unwavering moral authority. The community never forgot. Harlem's elders would recount to their children how Bumpy Johnson moved through the streets with the weight of both fear and respect, how a single confrontation redefined the balance between authority and the people it claimed to serve. That night with McCready became part of the collective memory, a cornerstone of Bumpy's enduring mythos, a legend whose actions ensured that justice, not intimidation, reigned on the streets he called home. In the end, Bumpy's legacy was simple but profound. He showed the world that true power isn't declared, it's recognized. True authority isn't imposed, it's earned. And in a neighborhood too often overlooked by the system, one man ensured that justice had a face, a voice, and a presence that no badge could ever replace. This wasn't just a confrontation between a man and a detective. It was a reckoning between two visions of power, one defined by fear, titles, and authority, the other defined by respect, loyalty, and the unshakable bond between a community and its protector. Bumpy Johnson didn't need to fire a gun. He didn't need to make a spectacle. One measured presence, one calm but unwavering assertion of authority, and the system itself had been reminded of its limits. Harlem didn't need headlines or legal victories to know what had happened. Every corner, every stoop, every brownstone whispered the story. The streets had their guardian, and he answered only to the people he protected. The detective left humbled, the badge still shiny but stripped of its illusion of absolute power. The community, once threatened and fearful, breathed a little easier. Children played, shopkeepers worked, and mothers walked their streets with confidence. Justice had been served, not by law alone, but by the unspoken code Bumpy Johnson upheld. And that is why the legend endured, because the story wasn't about violence or bravado. It was about authority confronted, respect demanded, and the people protected. Bumpy Johnson reminded Harlem and the world that dignity matters, that fear can be replaced by justice, and that sometimes it takes a legend to ensure the scales are balanced. This wasn't merely a victory for one man. It was a victory for a community. It was a lesson to those who believed the law was the only measure of power. And it was proof, once again, that in the heart of Harlem, respect isn't given. It's earned, enforced, and remembered. Bumpy Johnson didn't just face a detective that night. He faced an entire system and reminded it who truly held the streets. And for generations, Harlem would never forget.